The bright lights of NBC studios in Burbank, California were warming up for another night of The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. It was a Tuesday evening in October 1995, and the hallways buzzed with the usual pre-show energy. Staff members hurried, back and forth, checking cameras, adjusting microphones, and making sure everything was perfect for the night's big guests. In the main office, producer Kate Sullivan sat at her desk looking over the guest list one more time. Tonight was supposed to be special. Two of Hollywood's biggest names were scheduled to appear together on the same show. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, was coming to talk about his new Western film. Robert De Niro, the intense method actor known for his incredible performances, was also booked to promote his latest crime thriller. Kate had been working in television for 15 years, and she knew when something felt different. Today felt very different. She had received several phone calls from both camps throughout the week. Eastwood's people were professional and calm, as always. But De Niro's team seemed on edge about something. The trouble had started 3 months earlier at the Golden Globe Awards. Entertainment reporter Tom Mitchell had interviewed De Niro on the red carpet that night. During the interview, De Niro had made some comments about different acting styles in Hollywood. He talked about method acting and how some actors really lived their roles. Then he mentioned that some other actors just played the same character over and over again. Tom had pushed for more details. De Niro, never one to back down from speaking his mind, had said that some directors and actors were stuck in the past. He mentioned that real acting required more than just looking tough and talking in a low voice. Everyone knew he was talking about Clint Eastwood, even though he never said the name directly. The comments had spread quickly through Hollywood. Industry insiders like casting director Linda Brooks and veteran producer Alan Murphy had heard the gossip within days. Some people thought De Niro was just being honest about his craft. Others felt he had crossed a line by criticizing a legend. Like Eastwood, Clint Eastwood had been in the movie business for over 30 years. He had starred in westerns that made him famous around the world. He had directed movies that won Academy Awards. He was respected by everyone in Hollywood, from young actors to studio executives. But he was also known for being very private and not talking much to the press. When reporters asked Eastwood about De Niro's comments, he had simply said, "No comment." But people who knew him well could tell he was not happy. His longtime friend and frequent co-star, actor Bill Hayes, had told friends that Clint was thinking about it. For Eastwood, that usually meant he was planning something. Now, 3 months. Later, both men were scheduled to appear on the same talk show. Kate Sullivan knew this could either be great television or a complete disaster. She had tried to suggest having them on different nights, but the network executives wanted them together. They thought it would be good for ratings. The afternoon. Rehearsal had been tense. Eastwood arrived first, exactly on time as always. He was dressed in his usual simple style, dark pants, a plain shirt, and a light jacket. He greeted everyone politely, but didn't say much. He took his seat on the couch and waited quietly while the crew adjusted the lights and cameras around him. When De Niro arrived 20 minutes later, the atmosphere in the studio changed immediately. He was clearly agitated about something. His publicist, Greg Palmer, followed him around, whispering in his ear and trying to calm him down. De Niro kept pacing back and forth behind the set, running his hands through his hair. Camera operator Danny Clark, who had worked on the show for 8 years, noticed how different the two men were. Eastwood sat perfectly still, his hands folded. In his lap, watching everything with those sharp eyes, De Niro couldn't sit still for more than a few seconds. He kept getting up, walking around, and adjusting his tie. During the brief rehearsal, Jay Leno tried to keep things light and friendly. He asked both actors about their upcoming movies and made jokes about their different acting styles. But even Leno, who was known for handling difficult situations with humor, seemed nervous. The studio audience was already filing in for the real show. Tonight's crowd included all kinds of people, families from the local area, tourists visiting Los Angeles, and longtime fans of both actors. Mary Johnson had brought her teenage son Kevin all the way from San Diego just to see Clint Eastwood in person. Retired teacher Frank Roberts and his wife Helen had been trying to get tickets for months. None of them knew what they were about to witness. As the show's start time approached, Kate Sullivan made one last attempt to prevent any problems. Walked over to where both actors were sitting and tried to have a friendly conversation. She suggested they stick to talking about their movies and avoid any personal topics. Eastwood nodded and said simply, "I'll be professional." De Niro looked at her and said, "I always am." But there was something in his tone that made Kate even more worried. The warm-up comedian finished his routine, and Jay Leno took the stage. The audience applauded loudly, excited to see their favorite late-night host. Leno went through his usual opening jokes, but Kate noticed he kept glancing over at the guest area where both actors were waiting. Sound engineer Rick Torres checked all the microphones one more time. Lighting director Bob Wilson made sure the guest area was perfectly lit. Everyone on the crew knew this was going to be an important show. But they had no idea it would become one of the most talked-about moments in television history. As the show's theme music played and the cameras focused on Jay Leno's desk, both Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro prepared to face each other on live television. The tension that had been building for months was about to explode in front of millions of viewers. The stage was set. The cameras were rolling, and somewhere in the NBC studios, television history was about to be made. The red on-air sign glowed brightly above the studio doors as Jay Leno finished his opening monologue. The audience was in a good mood, laughing at his jokes about the weather in Los Angeles and the latest Hollywood gossip at backstage. Atmosphere was completely different. Clint Eastwood stood quietly near the curtain, his hands clasped behind his back. He wore a simple dark suit and looked exactly like what he was, a movie legend who had seen it all. His face showed no emotion, but people who knew him well could tell he was thinking carefully about something. A few feet away, Robert De Niro was still pacing. His assistant, Carol Martinez, tried to offer him a glass of water, but he waved her away.
Ow.
De Niro kept checking his watch and muttering under his breath. Stage manager Eddie Wilson had worked with hundreds of celebrities over the years, but he had never seen De Niro this worked up before a simple talk show appearance. Jay Leno's voice came through the speakers backstage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our first guest tonight. He's starring in a new Western film that opens this Friday. Please give a warm welcome to Clint Eastwood." The audience erupted in applause. Eastwood walked onto the stage with his usual slow, confident stride. He waved once to the crowd and shook hands with Jay Leno before taking his seat on the famous couch. The applause continued for nearly 30 seconds. "Great to have you back on the show, Clint," Leno said with his trademark smile. "How are you feeling tonight?" "I'm doing fine, Jay. Thanks for having me," Eastwood replied in his familiar gravelly voice. His answer was short and to the point, just like always. Leno launched into questions about Eastwood's new movie. They talked about filming in the desert, working with horses, and the challenges of directing and starring in the same film. Eastwood answered each question carefully and completely, but he kept his responses brief. The audience seemed to enjoy his dry sense of humor and his stories about life on a movie set. After about 10 minutes, Leno said, "Well, Clint, we have another guest joining us tonight. I think you two know each other." The audience began to applaud even before Leno announced the name. "Please welcome the amazing Robert De Niro." De Niro walked onto the stage, and immediately everyone could see the difference between the two men. Where Eastwood had been calm and relaxed, De Niro seemed full of energy. He pumped his fist to the crowd, pointed at several audience members, and gave Jay Leno an enthusiastic handshake. When De Niro turned to greet Eastwood, there was a moment that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. The handshake between the two actors lasted just a second longer than normal. Both men looked directly into each other's eyes. The audience couldn't hear what they said, but those sitting in the front row, like retired police officer Joe Murphy and his wife Susan, later said they saw both actors' jaws tighten slightly. "This is exciting," Leno said, trying to keep the mood light. "Two of the greatest actors of all time sitting right here on our couch." The audience applauded again, but something had changed in the studio. Camera operator Danny Clark noticed. At first, through his lens, he could see that both actors were sitting more stiffly than before. Eastwood had moved slightly away from De Niro on the couch. De Niro was leaning forward, his hands moving as he talked. Leno started asking De Niro about his new crime movie. De Niro became animated as he described the character he played and how he had prepared for the role. He talked about spending weeks with real police detectives and studying how they walked, talked, and thought. "That's what I love about acting," De Niro said, his voice getting louder with excitement. "You have to become the character completely. You can't just show up and be yourself. You have to disappear into the role." College student Amy Carter, who was sitting in the third row with her roommate Lisa, noticed that Eastwood's expression hadn't changed at all during De Niro's speech, but his eyes seemed to be watching De Niro very carefully. Leno tried to include Eastwood in the conversation. "Clint, you've played so many different characters over the years. How do you prepare for your roles?" Before Eastwood could answer, De Niro jumped in. "That's interesting that you asked that, Jay, because, there are different approaches to acting. Some actors really dive deep into the psychology of their characters. They study and research and become completely different." People, the studio audience, was still smiling and laughing, thinking this was just friendly conversation between two professionals. But the crew members were starting to sense something else. "Sound engineer?" Rick Torres later said he could feel the tension. Through his headphones, De Niro continued talking, and his words were becoming more pointed. Method acting is about finding the truth in every moment. It's about being real, being authentic, not just playing the same character over and over again." The comment hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in the studio knew that Eastwood was famous for playing similar tough guy characters in many of his movies. De Niro had just criticized him on live television. Even though he hadn't mentioned Eastwood's name directly, Eastwood's reaction was barely noticeable to most people watching. His face didn't change expression. He didn't move in his seat. But those who knew him well could see the tiny signs. His left hand, which had been resting on his knee, slowly formed a fist. His breathing became slightly deeper, Jay Leno realized. What was happening, and tried to change the subject quickly. "Well, you're both incredibly successful, so obviously different approaches can work," he said with a nervous laugh. But De Niro wasn't finished. Perhaps encouraged by the audience's laughter, or maybe just unable to stop himself, he turned slightly toward Eastwood and smiled. "I'm just saying that some of us actually studied our craft. We went to acting school. We learned technique." The implication was clear to everyone in the studio. De Niro was suggesting that Eastwood hadn't really learned how to act properly. The audience's laughter became more uncertain. People weren't sure if this was still friendly joking or something more serious. Retired teacher Frank Roberts and his wife Helen, who had been enjoying the show from their seats in the middle section, suddenly felt uncomfortable. The mood in the studio had shifted completely. Eastwood finally spoke, his voice as calm and steady as ever. "That's interesting, Bob." The way he said Bob instead of Robert made it sound almost like a challenge. The two men stared at each other across the couch. Jay Leno looked back and forth between them, clearly trying to figure out how to handle the situation. The studio. The audience was completely quiet now, sensing that they were witnessing something much more significant than a typical talk show interview. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The silence in Studio 11 at NBC was unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. Even the usually chatty audience members had stopped whispering to each other. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the cameras and the air conditioning system. Overhead, Jay Leno sat behind his desk, his famous smile looking forced and uncomfortable. He kept glancing between his two guests, clearly hoping one of them would say something to break the tension. His fingers drummed nervously on his desk, and he cleared his throat twice before speaking. "So, both of your movies open this weekend," Leno said, trying desperately to steer the conversation back to safe territory. "That must be exciting for both of you." But Robert De Niro wasn't ready to let the moment pass. Something about being on live television, in front of millions of viewers, seemed to make him want to push the confrontation even further. He shifted in his seat and turned his body slightly toward Clint Eastwood. "You know what, Jay?" De Niro said, his voice getting louder and more intense. "I think it's important for people to understand the difference between real acting and just ... showing up." The words hit the studio like a physical blow. Camera operator Danny Clark felt his hands tighten on his equipment. In the control room, director Mike Thompson held his breath. Producer Kate Sullivan stood frozen near the back of the studio. Knowing that her carefully planned show was spiraling completely out of control, Eastwood's reaction was so subtle that most people in the audience missed it entirely. But the cameras caught every tiny detail. His jaw muscles tightened just slightly. His eyes, which had been looking straight ahead, slowly turned toward De Niro. The movement was smooth and controlled, like a predator watching its prey. De Niro continued, seemingly unaware of the danger he was walking into. I mean, some actors spend months preparing for a role. They research, they study, they transform themselves completely. He paused and looked directly at Eastwood. And then there are others who just put on a cowboy hat and squint a lot. The insult was so direct and personal that several people in the audience actually gasped out loud. College student Amy Carter grabbed her roommate Lisa's arm without realizing it. Retired police officer Joe Murphy leaned forward in his seat, his cop instincts telling him that something serious was about to happen. Jay Leno's face went pale. He had been hosting The Tonight Show for several years, and he had dealt with difficult guests before. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. Two Hollywood legends were about to have a public fight on his show, and millions of people were watching now. Hold on, Leno said quickly, raising his hands. I think we're all just having a friendly discussion here about different acting styles. But De Niro cut him off. Perhaps he was caught up in the moment, or maybe he had been wanting to say these things for months. Whatever the reason, he wasn't stopping now. No, Jay. I think this is important, De Niro said, his Brooklyn accent becoming more pronounced as he got more excited. People should know the truth. Some of us actually went to school for this. We studied with real teachers. Learned the craft properly. He turned back to Eastwood, who still hadn't moved or changed expression. You know, Clint, some of us actually studied our craft. We didn't just get lucky playing cowboys. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. The studio was so quiet that people in the back rows could hear the slight hum from the stage lights. Sound engineer Rick Torres later said that his equipment was picking up heartbeats from the audience members. Eastwood sat perfectly still for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. His hands remained folded in his lap. His breathing stayed calm and even. But something in his eyes had changed. The laid-back friendly movie star had disappeared, replaced by something much more dangerous in the audience. Retired teacher Frank Roberts whispered to his wife, "Helen, this is bad. This is really bad." Helen nodded, remembering all the tough characters her husband had played in his movies. She had a feeling they were about to see if those characters were based on the real man, construction worker Pete Davis. Near the front with his girlfriend Julie Martinez felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He had been in enough bar fights to recognize the feeling in the room. Someone was about to get hurt, and it might not be physical. Lighting director Bob Wilson adjusted his controls slightly, making sure both actors were perfectly lit. He had worked in television for 20 years, and he knew he was witnessing something that would be replayed on news shows around the world. Every detail had to be perfect. Eastwood finally moved. It was just a slight adjustment of his position on the couch, but it made him seem somehow larger and more intimidating. His eyes never left De Niro's face. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that people in the back of the studio had to strain. To hear him? That's real interesting, Bob, Eastwood said. The way he pronounced Bob made it sound like an insult. Real interesting. De Niro seemed to realize for the first time that he might have gone too far. His confident expression flickered, slightly. But he was committed now, and backing down would look even worse on television. I'm just being honest, De Niro said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I believe in respecting the craft. Eastwood nodded slowly, as if he was thinking carefully about something. The pause stretched on and on. Jay Leno opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. Even he could sense that interrupting now would be a mistake. The cameras captured every second of the silence. In living rooms across America, people were leaning closer to their television screens. At NBC headquarters in New York, executives were frantically calling the studio to find out what was happening. Finally, Eastwood leaned forward slightly. It was a small movement, but it completely changed the dynamic in the room. Suddenly, he was the one in control. His voice, when it came, was still quiet, but it carried the weight of 30 years in Hollywood and dozens of tough guy roles. "Bob," he said, and everyone in the studio knew that whatever came next would be devastating. "I may have gotten lucky playing cowboys." He paused, and the silence was deafening. De Niro's eyes widened slightly as he realized what was coming. "But at least I didn't have to gain 60 pounds and talk to myself in mirrors to convince people I could act." The words hit De Niro like a physical punch. His mouth fell open slightly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he was completely speechless. The impact of Clint Eastwood's words was immediate and devastating. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Robert De Niro sat frozen on the couch, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with shock. The man who was famous for always having something to say, who never backed down from any argument, was completely speechless. The studio audience erupted in chaos. Some people gasped loudly. Others started laughing nervously. A few people actually stood up in their seats, not believing what they had just heard. College student Amy Carter felt her heart pounding as she looked around at the other audience members. Everyone seemed to be having the same reaction, complete shock mixed with excitement. Jay Leno sat behind his desk, his mouth hanging open. He had hosted hundreds of shows and interviewed thousands of celebrities, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. His writers had prepared jokes for almost every situation, but there was no script for what to do when to Hollywood. Legends destroyed each other on live television. Camera operator Danny Clark kept his camera focused on both actors, switching back and forth between their faces. He knew that this moment would be replayed on television shows around the world for years to come. Every expression, every reaction had to be captured perfectly. In the control room, director Mike Thompson was frantically giving orders to his crew. "Keep rolling," he shouted into his headset. "Get close-ups of both of them. This is television history happening right here." De Niro's face went through several different expressions in the space of a few seconds. First there was shock, then anger, then something that looked almost like respect. He had thrown the first punch in this verbal fight, but Eastwood had just delivered a knockout blow that left him completely defenseless. The reference to gaining weight was clearly about De Niro's famous role in Raging Bull, where he had gained over 60 pounds to play boxer Jake LaMotta. The comment about talking to mirrors was about Taxi Driver, where De Niro's character practiced his famous "You talking to me" speech in front of a mirror. These were two of De Niro's most celebrated performances, and Eastwood had just used them to embarrass him on national television. What made the comeback so devastating was how accurate it was. De Niro was famous for his extreme preparation for roles. He would spend months researching and physically transforming himself. Eastwood, on the other hand, was known for his more natural approach to acting. He rarely changed his appearance dramatically and often played characters that were similar to his own personality. But Eastwood's response had turned De Niro's criticism completely around. Instead of making Eastwood look like a limited actor, De Niro's comments now made him look like someone who had to work twice as hard to achieve what Eastwood made look effortless. The audience was still buzzing with excitement and shock. Tired. Police officer Joe Murphy turned to his wife Susan and whispered, "I can't believe he just said that." Susan nodded, her eyes still fixed on the two actors. She had been a fan of both men for years, but she had never seen anything like this. Construction worker Pete Davis felt his adrenaline pumping as if he had just witnessed a real fight. His girlfriend Julie Martinez was gripping his arm tightly, both of them staring at the stage in amazement. "Did that really just happen?" Julie whispered. On stage, Eastwood seemed completely calm and relaxed, as if he had just commented on the weather instead of delivering one of the most brutal put-downs in television history. He leaned back in his seat and folded his hands in his lap, his expression unchanged. The contrast between his calm demeanor and the chaos he had just created was striking De Niro. Meanwhile, was struggling to regain his composure. His face was red, and he kept opening and closing his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Finally, He managed to laugh, but it sounded forced and uncomfortable. "Okay," De Niro said, his voice slightly shaky. "Okay, that's good. That's really good." The admission that Eastwood had gotten the better of him only made the moment more powerful. Here was one of the greatest actors in movie history, known for his intensity and his refusal to back down from anyone. Admitting defeat on live television. Jay Leno finally found his voice. Well, he said, trying to lighten the mood with a nervous laugh. "I guess we know who wins in a battle of words." The audience laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that comes after a tense moment has passed. Everyone could feel that something important had just happened. Something that would be talked about for years to come. Sound engineer Rick Torres later said that the audio levels in the studio were all over the place. During those few minutes, the sudden silence after Eastwood's comeback, followed by the explosive reaction from the audience, had been unlike anything he had ever recorded. Backstage, producer Kate Sullivan was frantically taking notes and making phone calls. She knew that within minutes, every entertainment news show in the country would be calling for clips of what had just happened. The NBC executives would want to know every detail of how this confrontation had developed. Lighting director Bob Wilson made sure that both actors remained perfectly lit throughout the exchange. He had worked on many talk shows over the years, but he had never seen anything quite like this. The way Eastwood had delivered his comeback, so calm and controlled while being absolutely devastating, was like watching a master craftsman at work in the audience. Retired teacher Frank Roberts was already thinking about how he would describe this moment to his friends. "It was like watching a gunfight in an old western," he would later tell people. Except instead of guns, they were using words. And Clint Eastwood was just as fast with his tongue as he ever was, with a pistol in the movies. The confrontation had lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours to everyone who witnessed it. The tension that had been building throughout the evening had finally exploded. Eastwood had emerged as the clear winner. As the audience continued to buzz with excitement, both actors began to settle back into their seats. The worst of the confrontation was over, but everyone in the studio knew they had just witnessed something truly special. Television history had been made in Studio 11 at NBC, and Clint Eastwood had proven once again why he was considered one of Hollywood's most formidable figures. The line that changed the room had been delivered, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The rest of The Tonight Show felt like a completely different program after Clint Eastwood's devastating comeback. Jay Leno, ever the professional, managed to guide the conversation back to safer topics. But everyone in Studio 11 could feel that. The atmosphere had permanently changed. For the remaining 10 minutes of the interview, both actors maintained their composure remarkably well. De Niro, to his credit, seemed to recover from the shock of Eastwood's response. He even managed to laugh genuinely a few times and answered Leno's questions about his upcoming movie with his usual intensity. But everyone could see that something had shifted. The cocky confidence he had shown earlier in the evening was gone. Eastwood, meanwhile, remained exactly the same as he had been all night, calm, controlled, and speaking only when necessary. If anything, he seemed more relaxed after delivering his crushing response. He answered questions about his Western film and even cracked a small joke about working with horses being easier than working with some actors. When it came time for both guests to leave the stage, there was another moment that the audience would remember forever. As they stood up from the couch, De Niro turned to Eastwood and extended his hand. The handshake lasted several seconds, and both men looked directly into each other's eyes. "Good one," De Niro said quietly, just loud enough for the front row. "To hear you got me good," Eastwood nodded and replied. "You started it, Bob. I just finished it." Then, surprisingly, both men smiled. It wasn't the fake smile that celebrities often put on for cameras. It was the genuine smile of two professionals who understood each other perfectly. They had just engaged in verbal combat on live television, but there was clearly a mutual respect between them. The audience gave both actors a standing ovation as they left the stage. College student Amy Carter and her roommate Lisa were among the first to jump to their feet, still hardly believing what they had just witnessed. Retired police officer Joe Murphy clapped so hard his hands hurt, while his wife Susan wiped tears of laughter from her eyes. As soon as the show ended and the on-air sign went dark, the studio erupted in conversation. talking excitedly to strangers, sharing their reactions to what they had just seen. Construction worker Pete Davis found himself shaking hands with people he had never met before, all of them buzzing with the excitement of having witnessed something truly special. Backstage, the atmosphere was equally electric. Producer Kate Sullivan was already fielding phone calls from network executives and entertainment reporters. Her assistant, Carol Martinez, was frantically making copies of the show's tape. Knowing that news programs around the world would want clips of the confrontation, camera operator Danny Clark was reviewing his footage, making sure he had captured every important moment. He knew that his camera work during those crucial few minutes would be studied and replayed countless times. Sound engineer Rick Torres was already preparing audio clips for the network's publicity department. Within 2 hours of the show ending, clips of the confrontation were playing on late-night news programs across the country. Entertainment reporter Maria Gonzalez was one of the first to broadcast the exchange, calling it one of the most dramatic moments in talk show history. By the next morning, the story was front-page news in entertainment sections of newspapers. From Los Angeles to New York, the headline in The Hollywood Reporter read, "Eastwood destroys De Niro with perfect comeback." Variety's headline was simpler, but just as effective: "The line that stopped Hollywood." Television critics and entertainment journalists spent the next several days analyzing every aspect of the confrontation. Professor Andrew Lee, who taught film studies at UCLA, wrote a long article about the exchange for a major magazine, called Eastwood's response a masterclass in timing and precision, and compared it to the quick draw gunfights in Eastwood's Western movies. Cultural critic Nancy King wrote about how the confrontation represented a clash between 2 different generations of Hollywood actors. She pointed out that De Niro represented the method acting school that became popular in the 1970s, while Eastwood represented the more traditional approach that had dominated movies for decades before that. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Video stores reported that sales of both actors' movies increased dramatically in the days following the show. People wanted to watch their films again with new appreciation for the skills that had just been on display during their verbal battle. Fan mail poured into both actors' representatives. Surprisingly, both Eastwood and De Niro received positive responses from the public. People admired Eastwood's quick wit and perfect timing, but they also respected De Niro for taking his defeat gracefully and showing good sportsmanship afterward. Talk show hosts around the country tried to recreate the magic of that night by booking other potentially conflicting guests together, but nothing ever came close to matching the spontaneous drama and perfect timing of the Eastwood-De Niro confrontation. 3 months after the show aired, both actors were asked about the incident in separate interviews. De Niro, speaking to journalist Paul Adams, was remarkably honest about what had happened. "I walked into that one," he admitted with a laugh. "I thought I was being clever, but Clint showed me what real cleverness looks like. I learned something that night about picking your battles." He went on to praise Eastwood's professionalism and quick thinking. "The man is a legend for a reason," De Niro said. "He's been in this business for decades, and he knows how to handle himself in any situation. I respect that." Eastwood, in his typical understated way, was more brief when asked about the incident. Speaking to entertainment reporter Julie Foster, he simply said, "Bob's a good actor and a professional. We had a disagreement, we settled it, and we moved on. That's how adults handle things." But those who knew Eastwood well could tell he was pleased with how the confrontation had turned out. His longtime friend and frequent collaborator, director Sam Phillips, later said that Eastwood had mentioned the incident several times in private conversations, always with a small smile on his face. Years later, the exchange became a case study in communication courses and public speaking classes. Students analyzed Eastwood's technique, how he had remained calm under pressure, waited for the perfect moment to respond, and delivered his comeback with devastating precision. The moment also became a favorite topic among comedy writers and improvisational actors, who studied it as an example of perfect timing and the power of silence before delivering a punchline. Most importantly, the confrontation cemented both actors' reputations in different ways. For De Niro, it showed that even legends could make mistakes, but also that true professionals know how to recover from them with grace and humor. For Eastwood, it proved that his tough guy's screen persona was based on real-life confidence and quick thinking that served him just as well in a television studio as it did in a movie shootout. The line that changed the room had become the line that defined a moment in entertainment history, proving that sometimes the most memorable performances happen when the cameras are rolling and the stakes are completely real.